Hey, welcome to Tabletop Skirmish Games. I'm Lee, and in this video we're going to go through how I painted the Warcry Catacombs build-in terrain pieces. In this video I'll go through the paint recipe and process I used to paint the stone, wood and the metal for these awesome terrain pieces. At the end of the video I'll put links in the description so you can get the paint recipe for free and also find links to all the paints I use with up to 20% discount on the RRP. I'm super excited to get this terrain tabletop ready, so let's get on with it and paint some awesome Warcry terrain. This terrain is great if you're new to painting miniatures like I am. They're so well sculpted with lots of detail that's perfect for techniques like washing and dry brushing, giving some awesome results pretty quickly. You've got the wood, stone and metal, so 3 solid terrain techniques to learn and get used to. These smaller pieces are great to practice on and get your final colour paint scheme planned out. I used these to just work on a couple of paint schemes that I wanted to try, and then I picked the best one before I moved on to the bigger pieces. I did lots of research watching some awesome painters and took notes of all the paint recipes they used and learnt some really great techniques. I keep a notebook with all my paint recipes in so I can go back to them if I want to paint matching terrain in the future. After looking at my own paint pot collection, I decided to prime with Army Painter Necrotic Flesh and settled for Militarum Green Contrast for the main base wash. Then I thought I'd use a Rakarth Flesh as an overall dry brush and a final highlight of a Shabti Bone. You can check out my separate video on priming if you haven't done this before. And here are the 3 paints that really make up this whole effect. The first coat I used was Militarum Green Contrast by Citadel, and I gave it a really good shake to make sure all those colours were mixed together. Then I just used it right out of the pot and didn't thin it at all. This is quite a dark paint, and for terrain like this building, 1 coat from the pot was going to be enough. The trick here is to apply it quite generously and then work it into the recesses where you want the darker shadows to be more prominent. You don't want it to pool on those raised areas, so spread it around with your brush and make sure it goes where you want it to. This contrast paint is really good and flows really well, and it's really nice to work with. So the more you practice, the easier you're going to find it. But on a big piece like this, you're going to get used to it in no time. One thing I've learned is that ending your brush strokes where you want the most paint to gather is a really good practice to get used to. So I made sure I did that for those small recesses at the bottom there and also in between the bricks. Around the archways, I was careful to make sure it didn't go onto the metal areas too much. You can see some did here as I go through and get painting, but once the lead belcher base is applied to that metal, it was going to cover it all up. And so it didn't really matter too much. In fact, it was going to add a little bit of shadow, if anything, and really match the 2 materials together. This stage is quite quick to do, and it didn't take long to get all these buildings covered. But I still tried to take my time and make sure I wasn't being too sloppy and was really focusing on stopping that paint from pooling on the raised areas and getting it into those recesses. It looks very green here at this stage, but that gets toned down with the dry brushing later on. So don't worry about that too much. But here we go, it's quite striking, very bold. And you can already see where that contrast paint is doing the work and giving us some shadow and some lighter areas. With buildings 1 and 2 base coated with the Militarum Green, I moved on to the bell tower and gave that a base coat too. I'll do a separate video for this piece of terrain as it's got that bell feature that I want to focus on a bit more. And it's such a cool piece of terrain that I think it deserves its own video for sure. I've also got another one of these coming from the Mortal Realms subscription soon, and I want to do a different paint scheme on that and use it as a centerpiece for my Corvus Cabal. I think this will be perfect for them to place their grisly war trophies on when they come back from battle, and a great centerpiece for any photos I take of the warband going forward. And I think it'd be cool after each battle just to add 1 extra trophy or something that kind of relates to one of the fighters who did something cool in the battle, just to kind of keep those memories alive and really build the narrative and immerse myself in the world of the Corvus Cabal. There we are, that's the buildings finished, and you can see the contrast paint has done all the work here and left some really nice areas of shade and light. With the main buildings complete, I moved on to the smaller pieces of terrain that had some of the masonry in amongst them, like those barricades, the old fountain and the rubble. I was going to do these in the same way, just with the 3 coats. For the first highlight, I wanted a kind of flesh tone to bring down that green, and Rakarth Flesh was perfect for this. Here you can see the huge difference after I've just applied a basic dry brush of Rakarth Flesh. And it really does make a huge difference and starts bringing this kind of terrain piece to life. So let's get this Rakarth Flesh on the whole model. For this first dry brush, I was pretty rough with it, and I loaded my brush straight from the pot and then worked most of the paint off on some paper towel. This is kind of the main thing you need to do with dry brushing. Get lots of paint in amongst the bristles and then get it all off on the paper towel before moving on to the terrain piece. As this dry brush wasn't for the main highlight, I applied it in circles covering the whole piece. On the statues, I went a bit heavier in a downwards motion, as those areas would catch more of the light and weathering. Along those, I also kind of went on the edges at a 45-degree angle and just put a bit more pressure on the brush. For the tiles on the top, I focused on the edges mostly and really got stuck in to those great looking cracks and crevices that run along the top of the piece. I think these are really well done here, and you can see the different shades we got from the Militarum Green contrast paint, and then once this dry brush is applied, those two will work together really well and it's going to look great. There's also some areas where it's pulled quite heavily, and if that happens, what I found is you can just dry brush gently over those and kind of blend it into the stone. So with these two methods of contrast paint as like a wash and then a kind of relatively heavy dry brush, you can cover up mistakes and actually use them to your advantage and get a nice result from it at the end. There we go, that's the first dry brush complete, and I was so happy with how it turned out. With those 2 coats applied, you can see they've come out pretty good, and these wouldn't be too far off tabletop ready if you were in a hurry or didn't want to spend too long on the terrain. Highlight, and for this I used the Citadel Ashapti Bone. This is a layer paint and would work perfectly for this second dry brushing effect. It's a lovely warm colour, and I think it's really going to work well against the green base and go off against that Rakarth Flesh too. With a decent quality brush, I loaded it and then removed most of it on the paper towel. I didn't use a palette here as I didn't want to thin the paint or add any water to it. I gently flicked the brush across that awesome texture and let the terrain piece do the work for me. With so many raised areas, it really is a great piece to work with. Now this is slightly different to the first dry brush we did with the Rakarth Flesh. You want a bit of a lighter touch and really focus in on the raised areas, because this is actually like our real highlight that we want for the piece. So I did my best to catch those most raised areas, especially on the statues and the edges of the tiles, making sure the cracks are well highlighted on the edges too. This is where it really started to come to life, and you could see it kind of transforming as you were dry brushing. This is a nice eerie look, and I think it will work well against the backdrop of the Warcry above ground battle board. It's interesting how you can get some awesome highlights with quite dark colours, and you definitely don't need to highlight in white. Often it's good to take your base colour and light it by mixing with white paint and perhaps a touch of other accent colours to tie pieces together, or you can use something that's kind of matches quite nicely like this Ashapti Bone. And there we go, I think that turned out really nice, and the warm Ashapti Bone has really given the finish I was looking for. The building all highlighted now, and that's looking great. That metal is going to look so cool when it's all painted. And then we've got the bell tower all highlighted up. Lots of different elements on this that you'll see in the video specific to the bell tower. Really cool. And with all the stonework complete, now it's time to work on the wooden sections. The first coat I used on the wood was Wildwood Contrast by Citadel, and I gave that a really good shake to mix it all in. You've got to get those colours mixed up well, so it's good to check, and if you're not happy, close the lid and shake again. I used just a cheap synthetic brush, but it had a nice point, which is super important for this stage of the painting. I used it right out of the pot, You could use a palette here if you wanted to, but I used it out of the pot and then started in the middle of the wooden beams. As I got to the edges, the key here was to be really careful along the ends of the wood where the wood meets the stone. You don't want to ruin all that beautiful highlight work that was done earlier. So I took my time, worked that contrast paint into the recesses and made sure to end my brush strokes where I wanted more paint to pull, like in those shadow areas and where two bits of wood met. I really like to just take my time. I don't rush. I really enjoy the painting aspect of the hobby, so for me I like to just take my time, and if it takes like 20-30 minutes to do a small piece like this, then that's cool. I'm in no hurry. With all the wood complete, it's time for the first wood highlight, and you can see just with that wildwood looks good, and I think this could even be tabletop ready in a pinch. If you're in a hurry, you could certainly use this and it'd be more than playable. But we can definitely make it much more awesome, so let's get on and add that first highlight. I used the Citadel Mornfang Brown for this first highlight. This is a lovely rich paint with a slight red colour, which I thought would look nice and subtle as a complement to the green that we based in the stonework of the buildings. I loaded the brush and then worked off most of the paint on a paper towel, again taking care not to get paint on the stonework here. I used a flat brush for this, a little bit higher quality, but still a synthetic brush. Again, take care here not to get paint on the stonework, and use controlled strokes that go against the grain of the wood. This terrain is so well made that the details will do all the work for you, and building up in layers, you can always add more dry brushing if you think you're going to need it. Going too heavy here could be difficult to correct, so take your time, enjoy the process, and let the terrain help you get the effect you want. And that's our first highlight of Mornfang Brown there, and I think that's really nice. Next, I wanted to add some very subtle green blobs around the wooden pieces to give an idea of damp mouldy wood, but also to tie it in with the buildings a little bit more. I chose Plague Bearer Green contrast paint, which did the trick, and I applied it on the edges and where two bits of wood touched or overlapped. It's important to get it right in those edges against the two bits of wood, and on the end where the weathering's going to kind of build up and get a bit more damp and mouldy. Again, being a bit careful when I got near the stone. For the steps, I made sure to get right in those areas where muck and mould would build up and like to live. And I just imagined all the characters walking up and down these steps, kicking blood and guts and mud all across it, and that's obviously going to leave some mould there at some point. Once those green blobs were dry, the final stage was to highlight with a shabty bone. I wanted to keep those warm tones coming through, and as this is the same highlight I used on the stonework and other wooden scatter terrain pieces, I knew I'd get that continuity across all of the terrain. I brush against the grain so the raised areas get a hit of that brighter shabty brown. I'm not being too careful now to avoid that stonework because it's the same highlight for both pieces. I also gave the edges a heavier touch, which will help to frame the whole piece. Again, building this up in layers is the key. Don't try and do it quickly or all at once. You can always add to it, but it's going to be a lot more difficult to correct any mistakes and take paint away. As with all the dry brushing, load the brush up and then get rid of most of that paint on the paper towel, and then you can start building it up in those gentle layers. With the wood complete, now I moved on to the metal. All these metal bars are so cool, and it took me a while to decide on the paint scheme I was going to use. In the end, I went for a simple rusty metal, hoping that a reddy browny orange would complement the tones in the wood and look nice against that green tone of the stone. I started here with a lead belcher, Citadel base paint, and you have to give this a really good shake to make sure it all gets mixed up. I used a decent small brush here and carefully covered all the metal from all the different angles. This was quite a time-consuming process, and it took me a while to get in, especially going in from the sides, the top, the bottom, but it was well worth it to get a nice coat of this rich base across all the metal. There we go, all the metal base coated, really good. When that dried, I took Guilliman Flesh contrast paint and covered it all over the lead belcher. Contrast paints work so good over metal paints like this. Again, straight out of the pot, and I started applying it where I wanted most of the paint to be. I used a decent small brush again so I could get a good covering with the Guilliman Fresh. I finished the strokes where I wanted the darker shade around those rivets and edges, and although I wasn't too careful around the stone, I still took my time and made sure it was on the metal. Where some of it went on the stone, that's going to help give a little bit of shade and add to the rust effect we'll do later on. And there we go, with the metal complete. I let that dry and gave it a good 30 minutes to an hour to get a good dry before I went on to the first highlight. This was Balthazar Gold, and this is a nice highlight colour to use for an old metal effect, and it's somewhere between a rusty iron and an old bronze. I wanted this all over, so I loaded my brush, got rid of most of it onto the paper towel, and then roughly brushed it, taking care to avoid the stonework now. This was kind of a cross between stippling and dry brushing, and I wasn't being too gentle or careful here, because I wanted quite a bit of that to cover it. For the final highlight, I chose the gold 0.996 Vallejo paint, and it's quite bright, so I had to be careful here. Again, give it a really good shake and get it all mixed in properly. I just put a little bit onto my wet palette here, and then took a smaller brush, just an old rough brush, loaded it up with paint and removed most of it on the paper towel. I was really extra careful to get rid of as much paint as possible here. With this highlight, I only used downward strokes to get the highlight where the light would hit the most prominent edges and raised surfaces. I didn't go too close to the edge either, and just focus kind of more heavy on the centre, working my way out more lighter as I stroked down the edges. That's going to help kind of frame these pieces here. So a bit heavier there in the middle, lighter to the edges. On the twisted bits, I gave more attention and covered it a bit more generously, especially on those end pieces there. And as a lot of the paint is now off the brush, it can be a little bit rougher. On the inside, just a tiny bit. And then again, heavy on those edges. Adding such a bright gold can make that metal a bit sparkly, so I wanted to bring it down, make it a bit more dirty. You can see how the light reflects off it there. Here I used the Agrax Earth shade, a nice brown shade that would tie in with the rest of the building. Gave it a good shake and then used it right from the pot, and with a small brush made sure to get it into the recesses and where the metal overlapped each other and where the metal met the stone. With this small brush I was quite careful. I really wanted to get it in there and create that nice shade and remove some of that sparkly effect. I imagine this as like grime building up over the years and affecting the piece. So it's almost just blobbing it in, starting with the rivets and then just dragging it out. If it starts to pool on the main flatter pieces of the metal, that's not going to look too great, so I just pulled it away from there. Now I wanted to add a little bit of rust, so with some Vallejo Bright Orange 0.852, I took an old small brush and thinned the paint down with a little water on my wet palette. Here's the brush I used, so thin enough to get some detail. So I took off most of the paint now on a paper towel and got busy stippling into the areas where metal overlapped and where I imagined rust building up. These rivets are perfect areas to focus on, so I started there and then gently worked my way out onto the flatter areas. It's easy to go over the top with this stage, so I took my time and built up the effect slowly. As this is all quite new to me, I made sure to get used to how the paint behaved and how it looked after it had dried before moving on to the whole piece in the same way. Just like with the highlighting, I imagined more rust to build up on those mangled metals, so I went a bit more heavy here and built it up in a couple of stages. You can see there, those bits are definitely going to get rusty. So that's the first stage of the rusting effect I wanted complete, and you can see it's kind of really made that a bit more rusty now. There's little bits of orange are going to work nicely, and that's going to kind of give a little bit of kind of homage to the red in the Mournfang brown in the wood too. So we could leave it there, but I wanted to add just a little bit more detail, so I wet down the bright orange paint with a bit more water this time, and then thinned it right down, and then got a nice point to my brush by rolling it through the paint. Then I carefully added some drips where I thought the water would gather and cause rust to run down the stone, and also run down the different parts of the metal where it overlapped. Right at the base there, I thought it'd be cool to have some little drips just coming down there and running down. And if I put too much on, I just use my finger and just rub that away. When I rubbed away though, I made sure I went downwards in the direction I wanted the rust to flow. And now we have all the pieces complete, and I've got to say I'm really happy with how they turned out. I was a bit apprehensive going into this to get started because there's such big pieces of terrain, and I knew they'd feature as backdrops to all the games and videos I'll be doing in the future. I'll post more videos for those barricade pieces and the bell tower, as they've got elements in them that I want to focus on a bit more. I've also got other videos for the below ground catacomb terrain, like the bridges and doors. These terrain pieces were great to paint, and as someone who's new to the hobby like I am, I really learned a lot from them. My main takeaway from this paint session is to relax, take my time, and really enjoy the process. I hope this video helps you with your painting. I really love this hobby, and when we get results we're happy with, it's just such a great feeling. I'll put a link to my website where you can get the paint recipe for free on one of my blog posts, and there'll be a list of all the paints I use with links to where you can buy them with up to 20% discount on the RRP. I'll also put a list of all the paints in the description below. So I'll leave it there. Thanks so much for watching. Please like if you like the video and subscribe for more content like this, and hit that notification bell to join me next time on Tabletop Skirmish Games.